Hi everyone, this is Stan, your favorite Polish Taiwan YouTuber. Hope you're all having a great day. Welcome to today's show. Today let's talk about how the CCP is supporting Russian propaganda efforts here in Europe. After the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the European countries reacted swiftly by closing the propaganda outlets that were involved in spreading fake news. Right now, only a few EU and NATO members allow RT, which is Russia Today, Sputnik, TASS, and other Russian state-affiliated platforms to broadcast. I think that many of my Taiwanese viewers know a bit about Russian propaganda methods and tactics, such as trying to blame NATO's acquiring new member states for threatening Russia's security, or their attempt to portray Ukrainians as Nazis. When the war started, Russia not only didn't call it a war, they used some vague language such as special military operations, again trying to whitewash themselves. Of course, they were caught red-handed spreading multiple lies, such as Russians are not murdering and raping civilians, it's Ukrainians that do it themselves, and trying to evade responsibility for their war crimes committed. I think many of you heard about those accusations coming from Russia. For example, trying to blame Ukraine and NATO members for the war, or how they're making their audiences dub the United States, and how Russia doesn't respect the sovereignty of Ukraine, or even not giving Ukrainians the right to exist, spreading hate speech against them. All of the above mentioned was the main reason for many EU member states to close Russian propaganda outlets. But let's not forget about Russia's main ally, which is the CCP around China. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, they've been helping them with spreading propaganda. Let's not forget that China's foreign minister once said, the friendship between Russia and China is rock solid. There has also been a joint statement signed by Putin and Xi Jinping, highlighting that the alliance between Russia and China has surpassed all the Cold War-era alliances. I've been talking about this statement in one of my shows. There is also one important point in the China-Russia relationships, the media cooperation agreements they signed in 2014-2015. Those agreements were basically promises from both sides not to report anything negative on each other. And we can see what it all led to. These two countries are not only cooperating militarily and economically, they have built their own media alliance to support each other. Well, today I want to talk to you about the recent report backing Russia on Ukraine, China's messaging in Central and Eastern Europe, prepared by the Czech Association for International Affairs, or AMO, and China Observers in Central and Eastern Europe, CHOICE, collaborative platform. While reading this report, I've been thinking how similar those methods are to those used by pro-China outlets, as well as Chinese proxies in Taiwan. This report is looking into Chinese propaganda methods that are being used in Bulgaria, Czechia, Slovakia, Poland, Romania, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, and Slovenia. How does the CCP use the official communication channel, such as their embassy's website, Twitter and Facebook accounts, or Chinese state media outlets such as CRI, China Radio International, and Xinhua News, as well as local proxies to deliver differentiated and localized propaganda messaging that suits each country? While reading this report, we can see that some countries experience different levels of intensity of Chinese messaging. For example, Bulgaria, Czechia, Poland, and Romania experience a higher intensity of propaganda messaging. And there are also countries where such messaging is not as prevalent. For example, Estonia, Hungary, Slovakia, and Slovenia. At the same time, we can also see that currently China's propaganda methods are very blatant. For example, telling the citizens of NATO countries that the war was caused by NATO. This kind of messaging is not only easy to debunk, it will also cause the general feeling of disagreement from the majority of the people. This narrative will not go down well in countries of Central and Eastern Europe, which perceive NATO as a security guarantor. And the citizens of those countries know, if not for NATO, there won't be such level of security which we have now. Especially those countries that are neighboring Russia and have historical experiences with this country. There is also another type of messaging coming from China, which is trying to whitewash Russia. This type of propaganda will probably cause any good feelings for China that these countries currently have to vanish, as it's absolutely neglecting the history and the experiences of those countries. Central and Eastern Europe used to be under Soviet influence and oppression. Nobody wants to go back to the nightmare that communism brought to our lands. Therefore, this kind of blatant propaganda coming from the CCP can only attract extremists, both from the far left and the far right. Only these people in Central and Eastern European countries have a good impression of Russia. Now, let's look at different countries and how the CCP propaganda impacts them. Let's start from the countries where the intensity of propaganda messages coming from China is the highest: Bulgaria, Czechia, Poland and Romania. Propaganda targeting Bulgaria is mostly related to China's soft power. Messages regarding the war in Ukraine are not as prevalent. But what China is trying to do in Bulgaria is make the people doubt the United States. On the other hand, Czechia is facing one of the most severe propaganda attacks, mostly coming from China Radio International, using Czech language for most of their messaging. However, because Czechia doesn't have any sentiments towards totalitarian regimes and still remembers its past when the country was controlled by the communists, so the effectiveness of Chinese propaganda there is questionable. In addition, Czechia recently passed a new law penalizing support for Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Now let's take a look how Poland has been targeted. Propaganda messaging targeting Poland has been intense, but still failed to bring any results for the CCP. Not only didn't the CCP propaganda outlets get any support from the Polish people, CRI's Facebook page became a place where China's human rights atrocities are being criticized by the Polish Facebook users. The only thing I can say is that you shouldn't even try spreading a message on how bad NATO is in those countries that are proud of their NATO membership. Trying to convince people in the countries that suffered from communism that NATO is a bad guy here really requires a special kind of talent. The propaganda methods used against Romania were not as blatant. The CCP didn't show their support of Russia's aggression directly. Quite the contrary, they portrayed China as a neutral country or a peaceful country and tried to persuade Romanians that the United States only cares for their own interests, but China is looking for peace. It actually is pretty similar to the type of messaging the Chinese proxies in Taiwan are trying to convey. And we can also see that this kind of soft power propaganda is much more effective than the blatant support for the war. CCP propaganda messaging in Latvia, Estonia and Slovenia was not as intensive. Maybe due to China not paying special attention to these countries. We know that Lithuania took a strong stance against Chinese aggression. Latvia and Estonia have very strong relationships with Lithuania. Therefore, China probably didn't think that intensifying propaganda efforts in these countries was worth it. Slovenia's case is a little different. Some time ago, this country showed its support to Taiwan, but the CCP's propaganda efforts in Slovenia were limited. I also think everyone should pay attention to the cases of Slovakia and Hungary. What might surprise you is that China is not targeting Hungary with their propaganda as much. Maybe it is related to Hungary taking a very pro-Chinese stance recently, as well as appeasing Russia. Hungary has also been the only country in opposition to the sixth package of sanctions targeting Russia. And if we look at Slovakia, CCP took a different approach here. They're not using their propaganda outlets, but rather acting through their proxies. There are pro-CCP members of legislature in Slovakia who are acting as mouthpieces of the CCP government there, helping them to spread propaganda. While reading this report, we can all learn that the CCP and Russia have already built an alliance. China never publicly condemned Russia for its actions, and the CCP never offered Ukraine any substantial support, at the same time constantly condemning the United States for providing the weapons to Ukraine, a country that is defending not only itself but also the whole Europe. And after Russia lost its propaganda channels in Europe, the CCP provided its state media to help spread their messages. Since Russia attacked Ukraine, we can finally find out who is a friend and who is an enemy of the free countries. And Taiwan should also be particularly aware of CCP propaganda spreading pro-Russian messages. For example, there are Facebook groups supporting Russia that appeared in Taiwan recently. It's obvious that they're targeting the Taiwanese users. These fan pages are perfect for spreading Russian propaganda. They're not only praising Russian weaponry, but also trying to send out a message that Russia is innocent and the war is caused by Ukraine and NATO countries. Therefore, we have to be vigilant. Do your friends follow such groups? Maybe some of the Taiwanese viewers think that Russia and Ukraine are both very far away, and the contacts with those countries are very limited. And there is no need to make such a fuss out of it, or that there is no need to talk to those people who have been influenced by Russian propaganda. But you have to remember what Russia wants to do is make you doubt the United States. They do the same thing China does to Taiwan. If you or your friends agree with Russian propaganda, you'll also be easily impacted by the CCP's messaging, especially when right now China's methods are changing. They're not only using those influencers like Strikefire or Taiwanese Cousin, who have been very blatant, and mostly targeting the CCP supporters in Taiwan. Now what the CCP wants you to do is make you doubt your allies, such as the United States, or even cause hatred towards the allies of Taiwan. Those people will be pulling Taiwan back, and in a critical moment, they might even cause turmoil in Taiwan society. We should be more vigilant and pay attention to what kind of media people around us consume. Of course, while talking about the CCP's cognitive warfare attacks on Europe, the Russian attack on Ukraine only made everything clear. In the past, Europe focused more on Russian infiltration, but there was no in-depth discussion on what the CCP is doing. Present, the key targets of the CCP propaganda are not the Central and Eastern European countries, but rather the Western Europe. For example, seeing that the several countries in Europe, such as Germany and France, have always emphasized the so-called European autonomy, it is clear that it advocates weakening relationships with the United States and establishing stronger exchanges as well as economic, trade and political relations with Russia and the CCP. After the war in Ukraine started, more people began paying attention to how these policies fit the Russian and Chinese narrative. But for now, I don't think that there is much time for optimism in both Europe and Taiwan, because these political propaganda efforts will continue, and the societies both in Taiwan and Europe will only become more divided. This is something we should be careful about. Thank you for watching. If you like the video, please press like, subscribe and share. This is Tian. I see you in the next one. Bye bye!